is there some way I could help these young Marines survive? And the goal was to improve intuition. Neuroplasticity is this incredible capability God's given our brain to change from repetition. So this is very helpful for parents too.
Why is it so important for leaders to be able to let their brain process and to drop into that?
Right, so leaders, they're going to make better decisions. They'll be thinking through things, but they'll be using less words and less conscious thought. They'll be able to trust their gut. Doesn't matter what someone wants to get better at, and they're already going through great training, great leadership training, great sports training, great mindset training. Those are all really powerful, but this just acts as an accelerator to that.
What's the advantage you've seen with business leaders and salespeople when they have situational awareness when it comes to negotiating and sales?
Welcome to the Leadership and Love podcast. We will cover leadership, mindset, personal development, and sales and marketing. You will experience thought-provoking conversations with both nationally and internationally recognized leaders. Our goal is to inspire you and deliver actionable items that you can implement that are going to help you accelerate your growth. Get ready to discover the magic and the power when you lead with love.
So welcome back, everybody, to another amazing episode of Leadership and Love. Today, I have a longtime dear friend of mine who I've met years back at a networking / engaging speakers meeting, and we've stayed fast friends. We've worked on different projects. We've actually shared some stages. I actually brought him in to speak at a bunch of different events with some high school kids. He's an amazing speaker. He's got amazing programs, and what he does is very, very powerful. Thank you very much for coming today, John. Please tell the audience the name of your company and then a little bit about what you do, and we'll jump right in.
Sure. By the way, first I got to say how great it is to see you, Louie. I mean, you are so good at so many things. You help me so much with my speaking and all that kind of stuff. So it's great to be on here with you. So the name of the program is Combat Brain Training. Some people forget the brain. I don't teach people how to fight, right? We want their brain to be ready for combat. And it's called that way because my first contract to develop this was for the Marine Corps. And so back in 2007, what they really wanted, the Marines obviously, they have to be leaders. One of the coolest, Louie, you were a Marine. They're the best leaders in the world because of the way that they are always ready to step up. But the purpose of my program for them really was to reduce casualties. So the goal was, going into combat, there's so much data coming in. We wanted a way to improve intuition, basically, make the brain faster, more focused, get into flow state. And we found that the same program also helped people recover from the wounds of war, right? Post-traumatic stress, concussions, anxiety, depression, and so forth. So that was originally in the Marine Corps. It spread to Navy SEALs and snipers and pilots. And now in the civilian sector, I get to work with leaders at all levels of business and also athletics and sports, as well as help people recover from everything from autism, ADHD, dementia, and so forth. But that's why we call it combat brain training, because everybody in a way is in some sort of battle, right? We are always in a battle, whether it's for ourselves, our family, our teams, whether we're battling any kind of debilitation holding us back. And so the same program that helps people in real combat helps people in any battle that they're facing.
So, John, first off, thank you very much for your kind words. It's always a pleasure to see you too. And I want the audience to grasp something that he just said. And I think that, again, I call them golden nuggets, as most of you know that have been listening to my podcast for any length of time. But he just dropped a golden nugget. And I don't care who you are, where you are in life, what your position is, how you were raised. You have not gone through this thing called life without trauma. It's just the way it works, right? One of the things that you do with your program, and one of the things you found that's so important, is the ability for the brain, especially for leaders, and I believe we're all leaders leading somebody somewhere, for the brain to be able to process information as well as be intuitive. How did you come about this, and how was it developed?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Louie, because my background had nothing to do with the brain. In fact, the way I got most of my research done afterwards was taking neuroscientists through my program, and they would tell me what's happening in the brain. And one of them said, "This is so incredible. It couldn't have come from traditional research. This had to come from God." I said, "Okay, I'll take that as an endorsement," right? So basically, my background was process reengineering for big companies. And what I did was I took that framework of improving processes and applied it to the brain. We wanted mental processes, very specific cognitive skills. The critical component of my program that no one else does, according to special operations, is we use a very specific type of stimulation that starts to change the brain immediately. Because we all know that neuroplasticity, basically a capability we have, whatever we repeat becomes easier, right? We're actually developing those ruts.
Right. So John, I'd like to interrupt you. Could you explain for our listeners neuroplasticity, just so we everybody, because you and I know I've worked with you. I know what you're talking about. I want to make sure the audience knows what neuroplasticity is. So could you please define that?
Yeah, of course. And I'm glad you said that, Louie, because that's an important concept for people to understand. Neuroplasticity is this incredible capability God's given our brain to change from repetition. Everything you repeat, especially with emotion, everything that you do over and over again is going to form ruts in your brain. That's how the connections in our brain are formed by repetition. And so this is very helpful for parents too, right? So if their kids are not doing what they want them to do, they had to step back and say, okay, why is that? What habits am I creating in these kids that are making them do that? And what we found is that our brains grow the fastest up until the age 6 or 7. All these massive amount of connections. And you think about kids, they learn how to walk, they learn how to talk, they learn how to throw a ball, all these things. Well, it's that practice that makes them easier to do. So one of the worst things parents can do is let their kids sit on a phone all the time, especially when they're young. There's research out of South Korea that found kids who start on a digital device from a young age, some have developed dementia by the early 20s. The reason for that is because those devices are so shallow, it's not developing the really important connections that we build the rest of our life on. So the best way, in fact, the most powerful way to improve a child's brain is by modeling from adults. So you want to set a good model, but most important is interaction with your environment. So even the difference between playing with real blocks and Minecraft. Minecraft is a game, right? And you sit there and you move the screen around and it's fun and people think it's good for the brain. Maybe for thinking, but it's not making the connections to the real body. When you build real blocks, knock them over, throw it at your brother, he starts crying, right? You have all these different connections that are engaged at the same time. And that's actually the basis for what I do. So neuroplasticity is important. I created the field of applied neuroplasticity, which combines that knowledge with a framework of very specific cognitive skills, a very unique type of stimulation that research from MIT found would start to change the brain immediately instead of just in a week or a month, a year. And then an agile approach, which was from my consulting background, we're constantly improving. So the exercises I work with leaders today are just a derivative of the ones I started with the Marine Corps, 15 years ago in 2007. We just continue to improve it. And that's why we can create such powerful changes in the brain so fast. So the way this happened, Louie, was I was perfectly happy being a process reengineering consultant to big companies in Chicago. Aon, Motorola, did a lot of big projects. My brother came back from Iraq in 2006 and said, IEDs, improvised explosive devices, are killing us over there. Can you help? And I thought maybe there's a way to help, instead of businesses make more money, just help guys save lives. So I was able to get to an event the Marines held every year at 29 Palms, California. And the whole purpose of this event was basically to expose as many contractors as possible to all the threats of IED that they knew about, to see if someone would come up with an innovative approach to save lives. Now, as a result of that, because there's big guys like Honeywell and Boeing, a lot of small guys, a lot of innovative things came. One young guy had his own company, developed a new kind of jerry can that wouldn't blow up, right? So that was important. But we also had big companies with better armor on the Humvees. They had better radio jammers. But for me, everything runs through our brain, right? And so is there some way I could help these young Marines survive. And the goal was to actually to improve intuition, because the Marines who led us around the exercises were all Marines who had survived IED attacks. And the consistent story was, I started around this one street, this one alley. Something told me something was wrong, and I went a different way. The guys behind me kept going, and they got attacked. So why, two Marines, same demographics, same training, why does one have better, what we would call anticipation? Not just sensing the danger, but acting on it. So last day of the event, shaking hands with the base commander, General Doug Stone, I just presented my hypothesis. I had kind of one of these God winks, intuition you might call it, right? Basically, if I could take the process approach I use to improve operations and apply it to the brain, maybe we could make the brain more efficient. And if the brain was more efficient, maybe we could improve, intuition. And so what we end up happening was we realized, so I developed all these exercises. The main point was to improve what we call cognitively primed anticipation, which is another name for intuition. If our brain is primed to anticipate that something different is coming, and we can put that down into the unconscious so it's always operating, we can significantly improve intuition. So General Stone helped me get my first contract, which basically I had to prove it. So as a consultant, you're successful, you get fired, right? So they had a lot of psychology-based programs, and they're all researchers, and they got years and years and years to do something. I knew I had to be fast because I wanted to help these guys. So this experiment was set up with two platoons, 40 guys in a platoon. One was randomly chosen as a control, and then I chose the platoon I wanted to work with to see if I could make a difference. And I chose the worst performing platoon in the battalion. So wonderful guys, 40 guys, but they lost 16 guys a cycle before, rampant post-traumatic stress, 3 attempted suicides, failing a lot of their pre-deployment objectives. And the platoon sergeant said, John, these guys are going to kill my career because every weekend they're getting in trouble and the CO's kicking my butt every weekend. So I embedded with the guys, which was an incredible experience for me. You know, when you're out on the desert for 3 weeks with no running water, living on MREs, right? Shooting and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it was the most incredible, you know, Louie, you went through that. So most incredible experience for a non-Marine to be able to do that was just incredible. And some of those guys are still good friends. But during that time, and these guys were great about it because they were willing to do anything. During that time, I developed the core exercises of my program. And I took a framework of cognitive skills. I knew I needed to improve that. I developed non-digital, because digital is too shallow to really make much changes to the brain. All those games on the phone, they always say you do better. Well, you do better on the games because you're practicing. But neuroscientists repeatedly said for years, you're not creating any real world benefits. So my exercises are designed to target executive function, those processes, but also engage eyes, ears, mouth, hands, and feet, because we want those connections to be faster and stronger, and that also makes the brain work harder. So, and that's the core method of the type of stimulation that can change the brain immediately. And then with an agile approach for continuous improvement, we could continue to build on what we did. If this worked, let's keep doing it. If this doesn't work, let's discard it. So over those 3 months where I had to do this, the before and after cognitive skills tests for both platoons was one of the necessary. That was the objective metrics. And my guys did significantly better than the control platoon, even though they'd started at a lower level. Most important was their performance. Their real world performance blew everybody away. After 3 months, they were now not only the best performing platoon in the battalion, but when they went through final pre-deployment training, the instructor said it was the best performance she'd ever seen by a platoon. And in fact, there was one very IED specific course that they had to pass, but passing meant basically avoiding the IED. But my guys actually found the IED, followed the dead cord, and were about to arrest the trigger man when the instructor said, no, nobody ever gets that far. Go back to patrolling, right? They blew away those metrics. The best part of the deal for me was the only base the Marines could find for me to do this was K-Bay in Hawaii. So I got to live in Hawaii through this whole thing. So that was a good part of the deal. But there was a schoolhouse there, and the CEO of the schoolhouse wanted me to come in, Matt Tracy. Now he's actually president of Marine Corps University. he wanted me to try to see if I could help other guys. So the first thing we did was a marksmanship test, and half the guys did my exercises, half didn't. 14% improvement in marksmanship, which is better than any of the scopes that they tried to introduce. So then he had me work with a squad leaders course, infantry squad leaders course, talking about leadership. These young guys are leading 16 guys into battle, making decisions that generals used to make in the past. So very, very important, tough course. Average score in the Marine Corps was about 82 with several drops, mostly from land nav because that was hard. So we introduced my program to 2 of those classes, and the overall scores were 93 and 94, highest ever, and no drops. And then the next test, which was really supposedly a tough one, was the Marine Scout Snipers, which is one of the toughest in the military. Unlike regular snipers, Marine snipers also have the scouting part, everything else that's involved. So very, very tough, 30 to 40% dropout normally. With my program in there, only 1 drop per class and the highest marksmanship. So spread then pretty much by reputation. The XO of that battalion took over a battalion of MARSOC, Marine Special Operations in California. He brought me out there right away. So SOCOM. So over the years, I was working with the military, SEAL, snipers, pilots, EOD, explosive ordnance disposal, the Marine Corps rifle and pistol teams. Any group that I worked with, they significantly perform better. And the cool thing about it was they already have the best trainers. So I should step back a bit about neuroplasticity. From our perspective, there's actually 3 levels of neuroplasticity. They kind of correspond to a computer. So the things we do are like the applications on your computer, right? You've got your word processor, you've got your games, you've got your browser, and you can upgrade any one of those. It doesn't necessarily impact anything else. So that level of neuroplasticity we call procedural neuroplasticity. So when you practice something over and over again, you get better at it. We might call that muscle memory, right? You throw a ball 10,000 times, you're going to be a better pitcher. Doesn't mean that you can do math, doesn't mean you can drive a car, right? It's that very, very limited, but it works by neuroplasticity. The body's changing, but it's the brain connections that are really making the change. Now, the operating system of our computer would correspond to the psychological level of neuroplasticity, right? So many excellent programs out there. You've got mental toughness, you've got mindset training, you've got meditation, everything that where you're thinking or not thinking, over time you get better at it again because of neuroplasticity, and those are pretty powerful. But where I work actually is the processor level. So the fastest way to improve the operating system and every single application on your computer is just get a new one because the processor is faster. So that's what I loved about this. So these exercises improve their focus, improve their faster thinking, they reduce their stress, help them overcome their PTSD. It didn't contradict any of the other training they were doing. They were doing mindset training, they're doing, procedural training, how to shoot a rifle, for example. So that training they continued, but when their brain was faster and more focused and they could get into flow, everything else they did got better. And so that's how it went through the military. And now I work with business leaders, I work with athletic leaders, a lot of pro athletes, high school athletes. And then the really cool thing for me is at the same time, just the way it helped those Marines overcome their post-traumatic stress symptoms, I now work with people with a lot of different debilitations. So everything from kids with autism, ADHD, I have a client with dementia, we're helping him, strokes, concussions, because I learned as I keep doing this. So what we try to do is we don't try to fix anything, we just train the brain to be optimal. So when the brain is optimally performing, it improves your performance. And in the case of any type of physical damage, it will actually rewire around the damage to do what we ask it to do. And that's why the exercises were so simple, but they make the brain work incredibly hard to do that. And the metric we use for everybody, professional athlete, business leader, or someone struggling with ADHD, is we improve speed of processing. Because our brain's ability to process efficiently is the difference between a high performer and a peak performer. And it's also the difference between someone who's really struggling and getting better. So literally in an hour, we can improve people's processing speed by 10 to 30%. And then we just keep building on that going forward. So it doesn't matter what someone wants to get better at. and they're already going through great training, great leadership training, great sports training, great mindset training. Those are all really powerful, but this just acts as an accelerator to that.
So I'd like you to talk a little bit about your thoughts and your experience around the power. And let's shift the focus now, because again, and I've been through your program a couple times in a couple different locations at a couple different events. And as a matter of fact, I told you this before, I have it taped to my computer, and so when I open my laptop, it's the first thing I do is one of your exercises, and I flip it over. And so I'd like you to talk about the importance of, especially for leaders on the civilian side, the importance of intuition and what your experience has been with leaders who had the ability to not only process, but know that sense, right? Some people call it a sixth sense. I love to share with people, we've built an entire language around it, right? I had a sneaking hunch. I had a gut feeling. I suspected it. I didn't feel right. The hair in the back of my neck stood up, right? Whatever that is, what's your experience been when people have been able to tune into that more accurately on the civilian side?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, because what we're trying to do is one of the reasons the leaders, they struggle, right? They get overwhelmed with too much data. And part of it is because they have a lot of responsibility, they want to make the right decision, right? And they second guess themselves a lot, and they're worried about things. And so one of the core components of my program, you might remember me saying this, is we don't stop for mistakes in the beginning. We don't stop for mistakes. I had a woman one time just start crying because she said, I've told to be perfect my whole life. This is the first time I ever said, don't stop for mistakes, right? And so what happens is when you release yourself from that, you release the anxiety. And there's actually three components, Louie, that we listen to, and this is very relevant to leaders. There's speed, accuracy, and smoothness, right? Accuracy we don't care about, especially because speed is important, right? If you can make decisions faster and less stressed, you're going to make better decisions and not overthinking. But the third and most important is what we call smoothness. So typically we get overwhelmed, right? And we just are too busy consciously thinking about all the variables. But if we can put them down in the unconscious, it frees us up. And so instead of processing here, we process out here, and it creates a buffer of anticipation, right? To create that intuition. Probably the best example is an Olympic skier I trained a few years ago, downhill skier. She's going downhill 100 miles an hour. She said that after the training, she could ski much faster without falling because she can see the snow conditions further out. Now, obviously, the snow is the same and her eyes are the same. But because she's processing out here, this creates that unconscious buffer to make decisions. The same thing with leaders, right? So leaders, they're going to make better decisions. They'll be thinking through things, but they'll be using less words and less conscious thought. They'll be able to trust their gut, right? Because what happens when you exercise in the beginning, you don't stop for mistakes. And after a while, you start to realize that if you made a mistake, you have a choice. You can keep going, you can fix it. And that's what we want, because sometimes leaders, they second guess every decision. They want to do everything right, and it just adds stress, and they get irritable, right? And then they worry that they're going to do well. Whereas when that all becomes unconscious, more accurate, better, smoother, then they become better leaders, and they get more done in less time, so they go home with their families. So lots of good things.
And that's very powerful. And so for everybody listening, this is a very deep conversation, but I'd like to share a couple stories real quick. One of them is to what John was just talking about. As a leader, we're inundated with information, data, and decisions to make. And one of the things I saw in combat, and you might have witnessed this as well when you were embedded for those 3 weeks, is that it was not uncommon for a Marine that was highly trained, highly motivated to freeze, right? The proverbial stuff hit the fan and they would freeze. There were actually guys that I physically tackled them to get them out of the line of fire because they froze, because their brain couldn't do it, right? Their brain couldn't handle all that information and what was happening so fast in front of them. The other thing I'd like to share a story, a personal story, is that, like I said, I've sat through John's programs twice. And one of the things I did was I joined a vintage swing band, a jazz band. and I had played rock and blues. I shared this story with John at a live event about a year or two ago. But I had joined a jazz band, and so I had to read music, and I had to read it at tempos that I had never played at. Like in jazz, right? A swing band, we're playing 160, 180 beats a minute. And I had to read the chord charts. And sometimes in jazz, the chord changes every beat. And at 180 beats, my hand and so it had to get to through my eyes, my brain, and then out to both hands, right? And I substantially improved that using some of the things and the techniques you gave me. And I'd like you to also talk about, for leaders, and you kind of went down the processing thing, but again, I'm gonna follow up with the same question. Why is it so important for everybody, and I believe everybody's a leader somewhere in your life. Why is it so important for leaders to be able to let their brain process and to drop into that so that they can get in touch with, again, all those words we used, right? Their intuition, their heart center, the gut feeling, a sneaking hunch. Why is that so important?
Well, going back to what you said about the freeze, right? When we data overload. So I don't know if they used this back when you were in the Marines, Louis, but when I was there, they had something called Cooper color codes. It was named after Jeff Cooper, who was a marksmanship instructor for the Marine Corps. And they had 5 different levels of alertness. So the bottom one is black, right? Completely on alert. That's the guy who's walking down the street looking at his phone, bangs into a telephone pole, right? Don't want that. Yellow is relaxed alertness. You're walking down the street and you're aware of everything going on around you. Orange is heightened alertness. So let's say you're aware of everything and there's a car that's kind of swerving a little bit, right? So heightened alertness. Red is full on, I gotta get out of here. The car's coming at you. You jump out of the way, right? That's red. And white was the first one. Black is when you freeze, right? So white is I got the color. So white is the basic one where you're not aware. Black is, as you said, there's so much data coming in, all the blood flows away from the things you need to, and you freeze. And that happens when you get too much red. And so what's happening with the Marines in combat is because they were so overstimulated and so in red all the time that they went to black and they froze. So what they found was this type of program can keep you in yellow, which is where you want to be. And that's where leaders want to be. Relax alertness. You got all kinds of stuff going on around you, right? But you relax. You need to elevate your alertness because someone's got a problem over here or there's an issue. You go up to yellow, go up to red, and very quickly go back to yellow again. Because that's the thing. So many leaders, they worry, they're responsible, and they get overwhelmed with too much stuff to eventually just close the door and sit back because they're overwhelmed, right? As opposed to being relaxed in the fray so they can make those better decisions from that relaxed state.
Yeah, that's very powerful. And I think that you just touched on something. I'd like you to expound on that a little bit. So, and it's interesting because it's something I do naturally now, right? I don't think about it, but I'm aware of the environment and I can sense people's mood, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I use the expression, I know when it's okay to poke the bear and when to stay away from the bear, right? And some
Right,
people, yeah,
right.
and some people are still completely unaware of that, right?
Yeah,
And they'll say the most
right.
inappropriate thing or they'll say the wrong thing to somebody, but you could tell if you were paying attention that it's written all over their face, today's not the day to be screwing around or making jokes or being funny. What's one of the things that you help people and share with them about that kind? And I call it situational awareness, right?
Yeah,
So when you
right.
walk into your house, it's really easy to be living in the white. No, there's no
Yep.
alerts. There's nothing going on. Well, it depends on how the wife is or the husband, right? Or the kids.
Right, right.
But in the bigger picture, that's really a kind of a white environment, right? There's no real threat in there. But I call it situational awareness. What's the advantage you've seen with business leaders and salespeople when they have situational awareness when it comes to negotiating and sales?
That's a great question. A lot of times, so when I work with salespeople, one of the first things they do is they say they speak a lot less, right? Because when you're not aware, I mean, how often do salespeople, they know what they want to say. They got a product they got to sell. They ask the potential customer question, and then they go off on their spiel, right? And so what we can do though with the kind of training is you can actually process two channels at the same time. So what they find is they're much more alert to what the customer is saying, so that they're aware, right? That situational awareness, what's the environment? They're much more likely if they go into someone's office to be, you're a good salesperson. Oh, there's a picture of your kid playing Little League. I want to talk about that. You want to bring these things into so they're much better at picking up the emotions and the words from their customer. And at the same time, then they can actually process. So one salesman told me it's almost like as the customer's talking, he's rearranging the words he wants to say in his head. And when it comes time to speak, he just reads out of his head. So we eliminate a lot of the extra, when you're not situational aware, you're focused, just hyper-focused on one thing or what you want to say. So that's a way it can definitely help salespeople, for sure, improving that awareness. Not just this whole situation, but also of their customer and themselves, right? So we call that pattern recognition. If you can pick up your own pattern, they're always doing the same spiel all the time, as opposed to adjusting it on the fly like they need to. They should be aware of that. If they're aware of that, it can help them change that pattern.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So there's a couple things I always like to ask my guests. The first thing I'm going to ask you is there anything that I didn't ask you around leadership and the brain training, the combat brain training that you do, that I didn't ask you that you'd like to share with the audience?
No, you asked some good questions, Louie. The big picture, the main thing is people to just be aware of neuroplasticity, everything they repeat or their kids repeat, right? Those are the ruts that they're going to happen, and they can be aware of that. And as far as my training, again, we just operate at that core processor level that improves everything else.
And something I like to share with the audience and so John's mentioned neuroplasticity. There's actually now scientific research that into our 80s, we can create new neurological pathways in our brain. And that's what he's talking about. What he refers to so scientifically as a rut.
Yes, that's right.
But you could, in that neuroplasticity, they've proven into our 80s, you can really create new learning paths in your brain. New courses for your brain to operate on a different level and in a different way. And one of the things I think that's so important, and so one of my other favorite questions to ask my guests, and this is going to tie right into everything we're talking about, right? Because once we can create new neural pathways, we have the ability to learn and retain better. So what's your favorite book? The one book that you'd recommend to our listeners that was a book that changed your life in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, I would have to say, so when I was figuring out how I could help the Marine Corps, and I knew I wanted to do something with the brain, just at that time was published Norman Doidge's book, The Brain That Changes Itself. It's a fascinating book. It's now, 15, 16 years old now, but that really changed everything for me. It's where I really believed that we could change the brain, because up until that time, most of the brain work was under psychology, and psychology's belief was that our brains don't change. And he really, here's the neuroscience. We've got pictures now that we can show the brain changing. He's got a lot of different techniques from some very famous, neuroplasticians like myself who have done things to help the brain. So definitely The Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Doidge. Excellent.
Well, thank you. And that triggered two things. One of them, for veterans out there, I had a severe case of PTSD. And in today's world, I went through a thing called neurofeedback. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not.
Yeah, very familiar. Yeah.
But to John's point, they were able to actually take pictures of my brain, and it would show these red hot spots, so to speak, in different parts of my brain where I had been traumatized. And they did something very similar where I would watch a video and push a button, right? And I was triggered by some stuff, and there was music. And my point is that everything John's saying, I've lived through in a different sort of way. Now I've been through John's program, and that changed my brain as well. And so I can tell you, for veterans listening to this, I love you guys, you gals. Thank you for your service, but you do not have to suffer. You
Right.
do not have to suffer. There are remedies and there are causes, and you don't need drugs. And I'm not saying get off the drugs. I'm not prescribing anything. I'm just saying there's ways out there for you to get healing and get past whatever you've lived through. And we've all lived through it. And even if you weren't in the military, you've lived through something. And I share with people, even if it's your cat Fluffy dying when you're 13 years old, who am I to say that that's more traumatic than what I went through, right?
Right.
It's trauma, and trauma is trauma to the brain and to the body. And so there's ways out. And so there are a number, and at the end of it took like 16 months, I think. They took pictures of my brain, and those red spots were all gone.
Yeah.
It's
incredible.
unflipping believable. Yeah.
Well, speaking of that, we've actually had two different types of scans done when people do my exercise. I actually just had another one recently. One is with EEGs, which is what neurofeedback uses, right? Neurofeedback has tried to modulate the brain waves to be more optimal. And it's kind of cool. We have pictures of the brain getting into optimal brainwave states in 35 minutes with the exercises. So they're very complementary. And another one, because you mentioned the whole idea of the brain changing, another thing that causes our brain to change fast when we get older is the amount of blood flow through the brain. Because as we get older, our capillaries start to die out, and then the neurons they feed start to die, right? And we lose our memory. So one of our neuroscientists from Harvard recommended, and we actually did an ATG, which is the measure of blood flow through the prefrontal cortex of a 76-year-old man. And we can see the blood flow increase significantly. And he was really excited about it. As neuroscientist, he said, because when we flood the brain like that with blood, he said, this is a very powerful anti-aging program. Because not only can we reconnect those connections, but we can create neurogenesis, which is what you're talking about, right? Our brains can actually create new neurons even when we're 80 years old. So it's just incredible the way our brains made our brains incredibly changeable. I'm always learning more about it, but absolutely. Yeah, there is definitely hope. I always like to leave a message of hope, especially for our vets, right, who are struggling with these things. Yeah, get the help you need. You don't need to suffer that way. And get your disability, right? It's owed to you. A lot of vets won't take it because they feel guilty. Take it and get the help you need.
Yeah. Thank you for that, John. And one of the other things John said earlier that to what we're talking about, go a little bit into this, just a little bit. Your brain has, and John just said this a little bit ago, your brain has the ability to rewire itself around trauma or an injury. The brain is that smart. It has the ability to rewire it. But you have to do the things like John's program, and it will rewire itself. It will figure out and find a new way to make that neural connection. So, John, this has just been you and I could go on for hours.
I know, this is great, Louie. I love this.
Yeah. It's really, and for me, I'm the same way. I'm fascinated with the brain and the mind, right? Mindset and leadership, and I think a lot of it it all starts in our head. And
Yep,
so,
absolutely.
we'll put my team's really good. We're going to put that book in the meeting notes. If somebody would like to reach out to you, how can they get a hold of you? What's the best way to get a hold of John Kennedy?
The best way is, the website is combatbraintraining.com. Don't forget the brain.
Okay.
And actually, people that might be interested, so I just launched a program now to certify people in my program. So people who already have great coaching or training mechanisms, the power is in the exercises. So they can add some of those exercises to their existing programs. They and their families get the benefits, plus then they can help their clients more. So there's one of the pages on the website has a way to reach out to me. So definitely have them reach out to me. My email is very simple, just john@combatbraintraining.com. They can always send me an email. I love to hear from people. Just make sure you tell me you heard me on Louie's program if you reach out to me. But the website's probably the best way.
Okay, sounds good. Again, I love you, and every audience I've ever put you in front of, you were just a rock star, and that today was no different. So thank you very much. You moved my heart, and I really appreciate you taking the time, John.
Thank you, Louie. Thanks for this opportunity. And plus, it's great to see you again. This is awesome.
Thanks again for joining us and listening to this episode of Leadership and Love. I would like to challenge you to ask yourself, what's one thing that you heard today that you can implement immediately to improve your leadership and accelerate your growth? If you've gotten value out of this episode or learned something that you can implement today, we'd ask that you please share it with those that you care about. Our goal is to create more leaders who are leading with love.